Welcome to Minds Between Languages. We are thrilled to share with you the chat we had with Chris Mellinger on some of the main trends and problems of cognitive translation and interpreting studies. Hi, Chris. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Fantastic. And we're going to be picking your brain a little bit about some major trends and problems in cognitive translation studies. And I guess there's been a historical division, if you will, between more qualitative and more quantitative studies. Could we first start asking you about what the distinctions between these two trends are?
Yeah, so I think a lot of times with quantitative and qualitative research, I think the first thing everybody does is run the numbers. And so they think quantitative equals numbers and qualitative equals not numbers. And I think that distinction is helpful, but of course, nothing is ever that simple, right? So, quantitative research is often associated with trying to measure something. We're trying to assign a number in some sort of systematic way to a concept or an idea or something like that. And then with that number, try to understand a relationship maybe to a larger population. So like if we measure something about a group of translators, we try to then generalize to a larger group of translators. The qualitative side of things, we tend to try to answer the question of why. It's descriptive, it's trying to use data that's not necessarily assigning numbers to it, but you might do that with unstructured or semi-structured interviews or things like that. Where you're taking the data and trying to understand sort of a more holistic view. And it's not trying to generalize to that other population. It might give us some insights, help us generate some hypotheses. It might help explain what it is that we're seeing in the quantitative side of things. But the goal really isn't so much to take a specific set of responses and generalize it to a big group or compare it across things and make big grand statements. So that division, I think a lot of times, it's useful to think about. We have quantitative and qualitative elements, but it's not just a matter of numbers over here and not numbers over there. There's sort of a theoretical foundation that can sometimes differ.
Fantastic. And what would you say are the main contributions, broadly speaking, of these two trends to cognitive and cognitive translation and interpreting studies?
Well, I think at least on the quantitative side, it's really allowed us to start asking questions about causation. What causes what? So we can set up an experiment or a quasi-experiment. We can manipulate a specific variable or change a few things and see if I do this, what happens over here. And so that's really been critical to help understand very specific aspects of the translation process, of cognitive processes in translation and interpreting. It finds its roots a lot on that side coming out of psychology, cognitive science, psycholinguistics. There's a lot of these tools and methods that we've been able to adapt and use to be able to ask some really specific questions about cognition. So on the quantitative side, it's really let us do some experimental work to understand cognitive aspects of translation and interpreting. And on the qualitative side, there's some more research now that's happening with this, where we can understand the situatedness of some of these processes, the affective nature of it. And it doesn't mean that these dimensions can only be done qualitatively, because obviously we can do them from either paradigm. But there's been sort of a push to try to incorporate more of these qualitative elements into studies, or mixing the methods to provide a holistic view of cognitive translation and interpreting. So both are really complementary, I think, right now. And it's great to see them now starting to be side by side, as opposed to only quantitative over here and only qualitative over there, that they're starting to come together.
Now, that being said, I wonder if you share my view that the field has moved towards, or at least seen a strong emphasis on quantitative research lately, especially with the emergence of keystroke logging approaches and eye tracking and neuroscientific measures and other ways of gathering behavioral data from participants. Do you see this as a positive thing that we are sort of becoming more quantitative friendly as a field, or do you think that there are some negative aspects about this trend as well?
Well, there's certainly a big push on quantitative right now. I think we've seen a maturation in the field in terms of some of the methods that are being used, and not only are we seeing more quantitative, we're seeing more sophisticated quantitative measures and more sophisticated statistical measures and analyses that I think is really positive. You know, I kind of joke around about this in various contexts where, you know, the statistics that you might have learned when you were in school, that field has continued to evolve. And so it's not your 1950s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s stats anymore. You know, there's a lot more that's happened. And so seeing sort of the more updated view of statistical analyses being incorporated into our studies, I think is a real positive. I think it helps us as a field contribute to some of these other discussions where our work can now inform work outside of the field. I think it's not necessarily a drawback, but it's at least a caution in that because of the level of sophistication, I think we need to be mindful of what it is we're trying to measure and still keeping an eye on what it is that we're trying to understand. Are we trying to understand translation and interpreting, or are we trying to understand something else? And so making sure that there's still that theoretical link, that grounding in the scholarship, I think is becoming even more critical. So it's not necessarily a con, but it certainly is one that I think should be mindful of as we start to incorporate a lot of these new methods or methods that are being used in other spaces.
You just mentioned the field, the relationship between what we do as researchers and the field at large. And I presume you're referring to actual day-to-day, hands-on practice of translation and interpreting. Now,
sure.
When we're talking about this, we're venturing into the domain of ecological validity. So, and this is a topic that we've already commented on in previous episodes of Minds Between Languages. But I would like to hear your thoughts about this, Chris. First of all, maybe for newcomers to the field, what do we mean by ecological validity? And then how successful would you say cognitive translation and interpreting studies have been at meeting this imperative?
So I think that's a great question. It's something that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about recently with ecological validity. So first of all, the idea of validity is it's a debated topic, just validity writ large in methodological research. But ecological validity really falls underneath the broader idea of external validity. So this idea that we can generalize findings of our studies to another group or across groups. And we're really trying to, when we think about ecological validity, it's the extent to which we can generalize our testing conditions to some sort of natural setting for our participants. So, you know, if we think about it, though, a lot of times ecological validity gets conflated with the setting or the experiment. So, for instance, you know, does my lab look like what it is that somebody would experience in the real world or the authentic setting where somebody might work? Or sometimes they get hung up on the task, right? But there's really, you know, to me, there's at least three dimensions of ecological validity. There is the setting, which is very important. There's the stimuli, so the thing that they're working with, whatever it is, and then the behavioral response. And so there's sort of three aspects of that we need to be thinking about in the field. There's been a lot of discussion in translation and interpreting, particularly in cognitive work, on the extent to which naturalistic tasks or tasks that look like the tasks that a real or a translator and interpreter might actually do. And I think that's a super important conversation that is happening. But I also think that there are times when it's really conflated to this mundane realism, or this idea that we need whatever we ask them to do looks exactly like what it is that they do outside of our lab conditions. And so that, I think that's a danger. I think we need to kind of step back and look at those three elements, this idea of setting, stimuli, and behavior, to be able to make a case for something being ecologically valid. There's obviously trade-offs. If we're one of the things that's really great about experimental research is that we can control a lot of variables. And so we can get rid of all these variables that can confound stuff. We don't want all of a sudden to be able to find a reason that basically destroys everything that we've done. So experimental research is really great in the sense that we can control that, and we down to like the temperature of the room and the light bulbs, the number of light bulbs that are in the room, so that we have consistent eye tracking data, for instance. But there's a trade-off between that kind of control and the setting or the stimuli or the behavior. So in some ways, I think we've been successful. I think the field has been able to take that into account. But as we start getting into these very specific research questions, I think we need to always be mindful of these different aspects of ecological validity to make sure our studies aren't that we're not running afoul of some of these other aspects. They're all interrelated. It's not like you can have a truly experimental setting, but then the stimuli and behavior are completely naturalistic. Like they're all interrelated. So
I like that, let's say, threefold conception that you propose. And I guess you would agree with me that ecological validity is not a dichotomical issue, whereby you either have an ecologically valid experiment or a non-ecologically valid experiment. It's probably more of a continuum of how ecologically valid your conditions are. In this sense, Chris, if you actually agree with this idea, what would be your main recommendation for the field to step up the game and to do things a little bit better than what we've been doing so far?
Yeah, I agree with you. It's not dichotomous. It's not something that it's either yes or no. It lives on that kind of continuum, in my view, because you can't like put a number on ecological validity. It's not like this.
Where's the threshold? Right.
Exactly. I think one of the things, in order to sort of step up the game, is to think in some ways about trying to push away from the idea of, and I mentioned this previously, this idea of mundane realism, the idea that we're going to try to replicate the world, so to speak, in our lab conditions, but rather think about how our lab conditions can then be generalized out to the world. So it's a directionality sort of thing if we're conceptualizing ecological validity. I think to accomplish this, going back in some respects to the basics and the foundation of some of our research enterprise, defining our theoretical constructs, grounding them in the literature, ensuring that those underpinnings then align with the methods that are being used, the measures that we're using, the analyses that we're doing, and making sure that these all line up. And then thinking about the influences and constraints that the experiment may have on participants. So, because they're all interrelated. It's not something, like I said, it's not a matter of, well, I have this beautiful experimental setup and I have the perfect behavioral response, but my stimuli makes no sense in this particular research context. And so I think constantly going back to this idea of alignment between the theoretical foundation, the research questions, the methods, measures, analyses, and the way that we go about analyzing can really be important to consider when we're talking about ecological validity.
Awesome. And let me switch to another topic, not a less controversial one, let me tell you. I guess it would be fair to say that cognitive science at large is now going through a phase that many have termed the replication crisis. Many of very popular, well-published, oft-cited studies, when people try to replicate them, they just do not have the same results. Would you say that our subfield of cognitive translation and interpreting studies is also facing such a crisis?
In some ways, yes. It's kind of a complicated question for our field. There's not a lot of replication that happens, first of all. And unfortunately, when it is happening, it doesn't always get published, particularly if it doesn't actually replicate. I am aware of some multi-site studies where the same materials are being used in different contexts, countries, research labs, and they've run these experiments and it only happens in one of the three sites. So I think even within studies, there's a bit of a replication issue. There was a meta-analysis that I worked on, and trying to find enough studies that replicated with the right measures to be able to actually synthesize the literature in a statistical manner was very difficult to do. And it required going back to some studies that were conducted in the 70s to really be able to find enough. So in that sense, there's not a lot that's going on. At the same time, I do see some more, at least partial replication starting to happen. Or like this is replicated, but with kind of a slight twist or something, with a different language combination or, something to that effect. But yeah, I think it's a real challenge that we face, and I think we should be mindful of it because we already are seeing this is happening in other fields. And so let's make sure that the way that we're going about doing our work might help us avoid running into the same issue or challenge.
Right. Now, could you please lay out some of the main consequences that this could have? I mean, what about it? I mean, somebody listening to us now might ask, what's the big deal? I mean, if someone showed X once, why should we even care about testing whether that holds if we try to do it again? Could we please sort of lay out the consequences of this?
Well, I think it's important we're critical readers of previous studies because obviously the field has continued to mature and to evolve. There's a lot of studies that are out there, and some of these early studies or studies that at that time were really kind of opening up new conversations should be revisited, and we want to revisit them because perhaps for whatever reason, though there's some sort of underlying reason that those findings might be challenged now. So just because it's been published once doesn't mean necessarily that's the final definitive answer, right? Like one study cannot prove anything. And so I think one of the ramifications of this replication crisis is it's going to require us to revisit some of the very foundations on which some of our theoretical frameworks have been built, or some of the proposed ideas that are out there. There was in communication studies, there was a lot of research that was done for a long time on gender differences. And I think it kicked off 20, 30 years worth of research. And then there were a few meta-analyses that came afterward that basically said, wait a minute, we're not actually, the differences we're observing are actually based on other things. And so it had led to this vigorous research agenda for a long time. And that research agenda continues. And obviously, after that kind of realization that perhaps there were other factors involved, it's now refined and nuanced that conversation. So it's not something that that work is not for naught, right? There's value in that work. But if we aren't careful about making sure that there are replicable means by which to measure things, I think we're going to run into situations where we're talking past each other. My study, my idea, my measure, my concept, if I use that term, it might not align with yours because they're not grounded either the same way, or we've conceptualized it in a totally different manner. And that's a real challenge to make sure that we can build on, this scholarship is building on each other. It's a conversation that's happening on a specific topic. And so I think the danger of not addressing some of these fundamental research methods questions can lead to a replication crisis, because we don't end up with measures or findings that we can actually point to and all agree on.
We've been through, we've talked about the challenges of ecological validity and the 3 dimensions you outlined for it. We've talked about the replication crisis, and first of all, how poor a job we are doing at actually trying to replicate, or editorially even, how sometimes publishers or editors will turn a blind eye to a study that's just a replication just because it doesn't add novelty. And we've also gone through the problems of those actual attempts at replication not often converging in the same direction. So I wonder, is it all bad news for our field? And this is my final question, Chris, or do you see a virtuous way forward in the making?
Well, I don't think it's all bad news. And I agree with you about the challenge of publication with respect to novelty. There's a finite number of pages in journals. There's a certain amount of space. One of the things that I think we could be doing is rather than thinking about, one thing that I've seen in psychology or in cognitive science, for instance, is we actually see several studies published within the same paper. There might be something that sort of gets us started with, let me do this pilot, but the pilot is not the publication. The pilot then leads to the next, the full-blown study, which then leads to, and so there might be one way we might start trying to address this is making sure that we're not trying to publish on the smallest publishable unit. We're trying to actually show a holistic view of several studies that are all considered together. That's the first thing. There are fields that actually have journals that are dedicated exclusively to replication. I don't know if we're there yet. But what they often will require is that a study is pre-registered, and regardless of what comes out, so long as it follows that pre-registration, the journal then agrees to publish the results, null or otherwise. I don't know if we're there. There's, in those fields, there's hundreds of journals, and in T&I, there's perhaps not as many. And the same holds true with number of researchers. There's only so many. But I think these multi-site studies could also be interesting because it's building in sort of a replication in different spaces. And I think also, really, really reflecting on the ecological validity of our studies, the validity in general of how we go about doing our work can help stave off some of the negative consequences of this idea of replication crisis. I think it gives us an opportunity to avoid some of those challenges. So I don't think it's all bad news. I think that, as a field continues to evolve and mature, I think we have an opportunity to continue to do good work, continue to try to find ways to improve the experiments that we're conducting, the research that we're doing, and communicating it in a way that is effective and efficient, such that we can continue to move forward with a lot of really important questions in the field.
That is fantastic, and I do hope that one of the main outcomes of these minutes you've kindly given us is that these ideas that you've shared with us are replicated, that they are amplified, and that that they ripple through our community, because I do find great value in them. And for that, Chris, for your generosity, I thank you. And you'll always be welcome again to Minds Between Languages.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the chance to speak with you today.
Till next time.
Until next time.